So we're pretty informal here at Museums Alaska. We mostly all know each other. So it's really great to get together and share knowledge, and see each other once in a while. And so this time we're doing a webinar on cassette digitization. And this is something the EMP group really wanted to learn about this year. So we're like, great, let's do it. Let's do it with a panel because of course there's different ways to do digitization, different perspectives on it. And let's invite everybody. So I'm so glad that you all are here and can join us today. We have 3 speakers. Nikkita Shellikoff, who works at the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association, and she is here with us today to talk about, doing it in-house digitization projects. We have Hayley Chambers from Ketchikan Museums, who's going to talk about using a vendor and how you kind of prep it on your end before you send it out, and then also how you bring it back in and what do you do with it once you get the digitized files. And then we have Bob, who is our resident expert on all things digitization. He works for SummitDay Media, and they do a lot of digitization projects for a lot of organizations, including a lot of museums here in Alaska. So that's our speakers. And I think I'm going to go ahead and let them take it away. And then we're going to have questions at the end. You can ask them anything. And honestly, if anyone in the audience also has things that they can tell us, we're all here to learn and share. So pretty informal. We just want to learn and have a good time. So I'm going to let Nikkita take it away.
Good afternoon. As Dixie mentioned, I do work for the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association. I work in the Cultural Heritage Department. I'm a Cultural Heritage Programs Assistant. That means I do a little bit of everything, but my 2 main focuses are language work and library archive work, which is why I am here. A few years ago, our department director asked me to figure out a way to start digitizing some of the cassette tapes that we have in our library and archive. So that the amount of background reading and research that I did just to get started, it took me like a couple of months to decide on what tools I wanted to use, what standards I wanted to follow, since we didn't have anything like that at the time in writing for the archive, and actually finding a place to start. The device that I settled on and that I decided would work well for me, it looks like your standard old school Walkman. It does come with a USB plug-in. These are cheap. They're like under $40. And I do believe most of them these days come with a little disc or something, or a code that will take you to the Audacity website. It is a open source recording program. You do not have to pay anything for it. So if you include shipping, your cost is looking at less than $50 to get started.
What's it called?
The program or this goes by many different names. It depends on what's listed on Amazon, but if there is a place for links, I can throw Dixie a link at the end. And because this one I ordered came under the title Retround, but I just tried looking it up and I did not see it. I think they say Reshow now.
Okay, cool.
I've had nice success with this. It is simple, easy to use. You got your play button, your stop button, rewind, forward. Nothing terribly complicated. For the actually recording of the media, I did start off with Audacity. I have since moved over to Adobe Audition. If your organization has the Creative Cloud suite and you can add on that, that is also an option. It's a little bit more complicated as are most Adobe products. They do take a little bit of a steeper learning curve. As for a starting point, we have our cassette collection was a little all over the place before I really got in there and started organizing everything. We're I decided to start was on a lot of our language materials, like old stories, interviews with fluent speakers, some including like the who, what, when, where, how, and why everybody was there. Some just go straight into recording. That does make it a hair difficult to like decide like how to label something outside of our inventory number. Just for a little bit more background, since I can't understand any of the Unangam Tanu that is on those tapes. We do have like, I'd say it's almost like a 50-50 split, like half in English, half in our language. I'm still slowly trying to work my way through all of our old language recordings. Since these things run in real time, like you have to like sit there and watch and make sure you don't end up with like 15 minutes of just blank at the end because you didn't hear the machine stop. Most of the time I will sit, like I'll put a pair of headphones in the audio jack and just sit and listen along and get like my keywords and timestamps for what's actually on the tape, and eventually get that in a Word document and put it with the digital file. When I was doing all of my background reading for the standards, I decided on the Library of Congress recommended format statement 2019-2020 for what I use. That recommends 44.1 kilohertz at 16 bits or higher, which is what I do believe Audacity already, like that is the pre-programmed, you don't have to do anything to it until you export setting. And also as a WAV format, though I do also export as an MP3, like just so I can get it all over at once in the event that we want to share these recordings at a later date, because WAV files take up an enormous amount of space. I've done maybe 30 to 50 tapes and I'm already at like 100 gigs of just the WAV files. And I'm like, oh, that's a lot. I think one of the biggest things I have learned throughout this whole process is you have to be patient in like you're in waiting for something to get done. I am not a patient person by any means. But like since everything is done in real time, like you just have to like sit and like babysit your little recording device on whatever you're recording to, whether it be a laptop or a desktop. And also the need for a very large amount of storage. I do back my files up twice. Ideally, you would have 3 different backups and like update them all regularly, but I have 2 that I'm working with right now. One that is attached to my computer that I directly save to, and then I'll back it up to another external hard drive in the building. Also, 3 separate locations, also ideal when you're backing up and storing files, but you know, not all of us have that luxury of being able to do that, of having like 3 separate secure locations for your digitized archive material. Like ideally in a perfect world where money was no object. Did I miss anything? I know that was a lot of information I just threw at you guys. But one more thing. I just remembered. When I have this set up to my computer, you know, I have tape in it all ready to go. Everything is like ready to start. When I start recording, I will hit play on my program first. So I'll have a couple seconds of like a little buffer before I start the tape, because sometimes with tapes, like people will start talking right away, and like I don't want to potentially miss anything. Helen, do you have a question?
Yes. I'm unmuted. Okay. Yes, I was wondering, one of the things we did, and we got our protocols from Kodiak, I think originally, and we kind of tweaked them. But we were cleaning the tape player after every tape. So we used another cassette tape that we put some cleaning fluid in, and we just, so that any of the little fragments that come off of old tapes wouldn't gum it up and maybe wreck it for the next tape. And we also found that there were tapes that it was all static. It was gone. Some of the stuff we were trying to record. I don't know if you found that to be true.
I've encountered that. Like I think I had maybe like 5-ish minutes on like a 90-minute tape that was actually like audible. The rest was just static. I've also encountered a couple where like the very beginning is like wrinkled, like you can see visible creases in the tape, and I'm like, we're gonna put that down. And that
Nikkita said she was having internet difficulties, so she might have to pop out and pop back in. Let me see if I can. Nikkita, can you hear us? No, no. If you can hear us, you might want to leave the Zoom and come back in, if possible. Oh, Alaska. And of course, it happens on the day of the presentation.
Well, one of the things we did is I had somebody who is on the spectrum who was working with us. And it turned out that cassette digitization was perfect for her. She adored it. Because this kind of repetitive and something that the rest of us found extremely difficult and boring. It was perfect. She loved sitting there, working with it. You know, it was a process that had specific steps. And so I just thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great thing, great task for someone. Nikkita, you're back, yay! You cut out when you were talking about the wrinkles on the tape.
Okay, yeah, I decided to just like set that one aside and be like, that's a lot of my field. At the moment, we'll decide what we do with that one later.
Awesome.
And I think that is it for me. Do we want to move on to Hayley?
Sure, we can always come back and ask lots of questions from Nikkita later. So I will remove your spotlight and put it on Hayley. Are you ready, Hayley?
Yeah, I think I'll start sharing my screen, but I just want to thank everyone for coming today and listening to this. I think it's really important that we're talking about digitizing, because it's becoming, I'm assuming that others are experiencing similar donations like we are, where we're getting a lot more film, cassette tapes, analog materials, and I kind of anticipate that we're going to get more. So we've been looking at digitization for a while, and let me share my screen here. Start from the beginning. Oh, all right. So when Nikkita was talking about the crinkled tape, I had to think about this guy. This was something that we found in storage, and it unfortunately had the tape pulled out. So I like to call that tape barf when that happens. But anyways, we here at Ketchikan Museums, I am the Senior Curator of Collections, so I generally take care of the collection. I do a lot of research and working with the public, and like I said, we're getting a lot more kind of media related donations. So we've been thinking about digitizing now for a while, and how important it is for understanding our collection and for being able to provide access, and also being able to just take care of things in general. So we actually, we have done 2 grant projects through Collections Management Fund with SummitDay Media. And I just kind of wanted to briefly touch about the first project that we did, which involved some more endangered material types. So we had some old film reels that were like a 1960s era Sony stuff, pneumatic tapes, things that we didn't have any kind of equipment to play in-house. And that was kind of how we prioritized sending those materials off. But then, you know, like COVID hit, and I'm sure like a lot of you guys, we were really confronted with like, let's make more stuff available digitally online. And we started to look at the collection of recordings that we had previously labeled as oral histories. I'll kind of touch on it later. A surprise, they were not all oral histories that we discovered. But we're kind of factoring in a few things just on a like an institutional level. So we had hired a new program coordinator who is our fabulous Erica Jane Christian. And one of her main jobs was to reinvigorate our oral history program. And she's now leading the newer interviews that we are creating. And those are all in a digital format. And then myself and the other person in collections here is Erica Brown, and we are working with the legacy collection. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. The second grant that we did for Museums Alaska, it was primarily cassette tapes, but we had sent off a few vinyl records and a few Betacam tapes. Just again, thinking about those formats that we don't either have the technology to convert the equipment in-house, or we don't have the staff knowledge to do that. With the cassette tapes, we had kind of explored a few options over the years. There had been different staff members that had skill sets that they were really skilled with media and media projects, but once they left, it became less of a priority. But at one time, I wanted to share that this another opportunity that we had explored might end up being helpful for other small museums. But we have a great relationship with our local radio stations, and one of them has equipment where we could play the cassette tapes and make at least access copies of the tapes. But we would have to have staff there physically doing the work, and the product would have been like lower quality files. So we were exploring that, and then we thought, man, you know, it might be a nice grant, Collections Management Fund grant project. So we had talked with Dixie ahead of time and proposed the idea, and it sounded like a good one. So that's what we went ahead with. So I just wanted to touch on a little bit of stuff about writing the grant. It was really helpful to work with Bob on his end as the vendor. We had already worked with him on the previous project, so we knew that we wanted to work with him again on our next project. He was really helpful in trying to figure out, like, initially how much content we had. So one of the challenges was, I'm definitely not a math person, but we had to kind of go through and create like an initial inventory. So this is what 284 cassette tapes looks like, and kind of went through and figured out how many 30-minute ones, 60-minute, 90-minute, 120 minutes, and then from that we had a rough estimate of like the maximum amount of content that we could have. And in Bob's estimate, and he can probably speak about this as well, but we budgeted for 60% content. And I'll talk about a little bit more of our surprise when we actually ended up having more content than we initially expected. Another part of the grant project that was really important to us was being able to make multiple formats or multiple versions of digital copies. So we worked with Bob to create lower quality access copies. So these were like MP3, MP4 files. And we also had an array of higher quality preservation copies. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later on. So it was great news when we got the grant. And that was in, I think, the middle of 2021. And our grant project spilled over into the next year, which ended up working out really well for us to have it divided that way. But after we got the grant, then it was like, all right, we got to get these tapes ready to go, get this stuff ready to send out to Anchorage, where SummitDay Media is located. So one of the things that was interesting to address was the fact that like a lot of our cassette tapes, we really didn't know anything about them. Like we only had their labels, if they had a label to go on. So some of the tapes, we have like a little boombox here, and I would do like a preview to just make sure that there was some kind of content on the tape. A couple of the tapes that we ended up sending out were blank, no labels, and they didn't have any content. So we tried to call that out as best we could. So we were sending off good quality stuff. But I remembered from the previous project with SummitDay Media, a lot of that stuff that we sent out didn't have an ID number, didn't have a really great way of tracking it. Some things without labels, it's just hard to identify. So what I did was just create a basic tracking number. So just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can see those little cards. So they would get slipped into the cassette case when we sent them off. Some of the tapes didn't have cases, so that was part of our process too, of just buying some blank cases and making sure everyone had some kind of case. And then these are a couple examples of pictures that I took. I decided to do batch photos just to make the process easier, and it was still kind of it was still a lot of work processing almost 300 cassette tapes. But then we'd gotten some advice too from Bob about how to pack and send stuff up to Anchorage. So what we did was just pack smaller boxes that nested into bigger boxes. And I love the top right photo is great because Bob gave us some extra advice because Ketchikan is so wet that we put the boxes into garbage bags to just add some extra protection so that things wouldn't get wet. We try as best as we can, but sometimes it happens here. We have to take our vehicle over to our airport on a ferry, and there's just a lot of variables. And you can see some of the notes on the boxes that we wrote, just so that there was some easy, accessible information for people that would be handling the boxes. And there were some, the little orange things, it's a little hard to see, but they're labels that mentioned that it's magnetic media, so to be extra careful with it. And then we sent stuff up on Gold Streak so that it really minimized the amount of time that things were in the air. So that was awesome. We got things like sent off out of our hands. That was the easiest part of the, the easiest part of the grant, was getting stuff sent out. And throughout the project, it was great that Bob, he kept us updated on how the digitizing was going. I mentioned a little bit earlier in our initial estimate for the grant, we had budgeted that we would have a 60% return rate on content. And we ended up with about 80% return rate. So that was good news in the sense that we had all of this extra wonderful content. The bad news is that it ended up costing a little bit more money. So that was something where we had to be a little bit creative with our budgets, and it was kind of nice that we were able to do the project over the course of 2 different years so that we were able to use money from each year to help pay for the project. And stuff came back. Stuff came back last year, and this is just an example. I'm sure that Bob is going to talk about this quite a bit more. But one of the really nice things that came back with our digital files are asset photos that he had taken. So it has the number that I had applied to it, as well as the number that SummitDay Media had applied to it with their barcode. And that number, it's really helpful. We have a new inventory that lists out our object ID numbers and how it matches up with SummitDay Media's numbers. Their numbers appear in the different file types that we get. So it's really important to keep track of that number and not lose content. I'm sure that Bob will talk about this a little bit more as well, but our different formats that came back, we would get materials. I think generally the access copies were on the hard drive, and then the preservation copies were on archival CDs, as well as the LTO discs. And really, one of the first things that we did when we got the content back was we went and talked with our IT department. So people that might not know, Ketchikan Museums is a part of the city of Ketchikan. So we're really fortunate to, one, have an IT department, but two, also we've got, we're part of a network. The city of Ketchikan has a network, and then the museum department here. We have our own special network. And Nikkita was talking about how much data can be generated. It is really incredible how much data we ended up getting back from all of the materials that we had sent out with this project. The access copies were, it was a little over 80 gigabytes, and being able to copy something from the external hard drive to our network would have taken a really long amount of time. And our IT department, they wrote a little code and they transferred the files in about 15-20 minutes, which was awesome, because it would have taken me like a day or two to get all of that data transferred over. Like Nikkita was saying too, we've been a little bit on hold about the preservation copies. They're a lot bigger files. That data is over a terabyte, or around a terabyte of information, which is a lot. So we've kind of built it in that eventually our computer network size will grow, and when it grows, we'll be able to add the preservation copies onto the network. But last year was kind of a big year for disaster planning. So we made an arrangement with our IT department where they put a backup copy of the whole entire museum's network on an LTO disk, which is this one here in the middle. It looks like this. And we sent a copy off-site to Juneau, to the State Museum, so that there's a redundant copy, like not in Ketchikan. Our IT department does redundant copies as well, but things happen. Just on Sunday, there was a really massive fire that happened in downtown Ketchikan, and it was maybe like a 2-minute walk from our historical museum. So things can happen. Our location to our IT department is fairly close, so we're trying to be mindful about that and making sure there's lots and lots of redundancies. But then, like stuff came back, and we're like, oh man, what do we do with it? So initially, we re-inventoried everything. We matched up the SummitDay Media numbers. We have been applying numbers to tapes that didn't have numbers previously, or some of our tapes were part of archival collections, so they had been given one number for upwards of 20 to 30 tapes. So we decided we wanted to make each one have its own unique number. We've also been just kind of doing spot checks. When we initially got stuff back, we would spend maybe, a minute or two, if that, just listening to each file and just kind of seeing what it is that we had. And we've kind of realized that we had way more than oral histories. There were conference recordings, there were exhibit planning meetings, there were lectures, there were church recordings, there were potential language materials. So we're kind of sorting through all of that and trying to prioritize. We've selected out a few collections where we have a little bit more information. So they've been kind of our segue into this, breaking down this huge project. So we've been working on these few collections. Their background is that they were part of a class project. Many of them had been donated by a former University of Alaska Southeast professor, and he had history classes where he would have his students go, and usually they'd interview somebody in the family or some notable person, and then they would write up a transcript of that. So we've started to listen to those interviews in more detail, and that's kind of where this summary sheet comes into play. One of the things that I had noticed early on was that we were constantly trying to go back and find information on interviews, like did it have permissions, and how long was the tape, and how many different formats it was in. So I created this document. It's actually a little bit longer than what you see here, but I kind of envisioned it as a one-stop shop where we have all that basic information. We consulted with other archives, like the University of Alaska Fairbanks staff. They have been really wonderful in answering lots of questions and kind of helping us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to processing and seeking out permissions. They've given us some helpful guidelines, and one of the things that's important with this document is being able to record our interactions with people, of who we're talking to, when we're talking to them, what their contact information is. The majority of the cassette tapes that we've been dealing with, they're from like the 1970s through the 90s, and a lot of the speakers have passed away since then, and even some of their children have passed away. So in some cases, we're on a third generation of trying to seek out permission. But it's a part of our due diligence to be documenting our attempts to contact people. There's certainly going to be interviews where we're not going to have people to contact. There's some people that we know They have passed away, their partner has passed away, and they didn't have any children. And in some cases, like the executor of their estate has also passed away. So there's some stuff that eventually when we do share it publicly, we'll make a judgment call on doing that. But right now, we've kind of the part of the process that we're in is, again, kind of prioritizing permissions, but we're also doing a lot of genealogy research. I have a super amazing volunteer named Linda who has spent dozens of hours going through our obituary files and our people files and trying to find information on people. And that's been really helpful for us too as we start to look at the tapes. There was one person whose name we didn't recognize but had his obituary, and we knew that he was a boat builder. So it might be a logical assumption that, you know, maybe his interview touches on boat building in some capacity. And the obituaries have been super helpful in identifying like descendants or potential descendants. Now that we're kind of getting into listening to the interviews, the summary form here is kind of helping me prioritize certain aspects of our project. Like I said, 284 tapes is massive, and it's a heck of a lot of work. It's not anything we're going to get done this year, not next year, maybe not the next few years, but we're at least starting to listen to the tapes, the full tape. We're starting to make notes about highlights, any issues with the audio quality, so that other staff can work on making improvements if there are things that we need to edit out. If there's content that is awesome that we want to highlight, or content that might be questionable, things that we might have future questions about. I know one of the interviews that we did more recently, the narrator talked about his son having an alcohol problem, and he talked about some pretty explicit things that had happened, and we were able, although he didn't put any restrictions on his interview, it was something that we thought, well, you know, maybe let's talk to the son and make sure that that's okay with him. Like, if we share that, do we take that out? Another part of the process of having materials sent out and digitized is that what we got back was just the straight audio. There weren't adjustments made to it, so sometimes we have to go back and maybe increase the volume, or there's a background noise that's really annoying and we need to take that out. But one of the things that my volunteers been really good about is just making a note of, like, are there potential other issues with the interview and the transcript? Like, one person had Parkinson's, and that there was some memory loss there, and she made a note that, you know, there's the potential for memory loss in this interview. So helpful for that. We are getting ready to embark on like a formal campaign to go out and get permissions. But I've been fortunate this summer to have had like some awesome random encounters. So when people have contacted the museum for another purpose, I try really hard to stay on top of, like, oh, your family also has an oral history. And that we've been really fortunate about, because one of our donors this summer was a woman who used to live in Ketchikan, now lives in Mississippi, and her brother and her sister-in-law had done an interview, and I was able to provide her a copy of the interview, and she was able to listen to it, give us some feedback, like, hey, there's some information that might not be correct in this interview. That's been super helpful. I've also co-opted some of our researchers who've been interested in certain topics, and I'm like, oh, you know, we have this new recording of this person. Would you mind listening? And, you know, by the way, while you listen, can you just take some notes for us? So that's been really helpful to kind of get through a massive amount of data, because it, in theory, seems easy. I'll just sit down and I'll listen to stuff, and then, you know, things happen. There are meetings, phone calls, emails to respond to, and then you really aren't able to listen to too much. So we're still very much in the early stages of kind of figuring out how to do this, but we're making good progress. We're getting stuff done, and our hope is to be able to share more of these materials on our online capacities. We have Past Perfect, so we've been using virtual exhibits, their component for virtual exhibits, and Past Perfect Online. And we also have a YouTube page where we are starting to share more content that way. So our hope is that we'll continue to add to this every year and make more of the collection known and available. And then I just had to sneak this in as one of my favorite memes recently. But I've got my contact information there if anybody wants to reach out. Feel free to give me a shout. And also very much willing to hear what others are doing and how they've worked through other digitizing projects. I think there's not really a sense of reinventing the wheel, so it's wonderful when we have opportunities like this to be able to share with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Hayley. That was super informative. We're going to move on to Bob, who is also going to talk about this same project on his side of things. So we're going to do this. Ready?
Yeah, maybe we should all do chair calisthenics for a couple of minutes.
I know.
Now that we're
It's a long
45 minutes,
presentation.
we're halfway through. Here we go.
Hopefully it's a lot of good information for everyone.
Off the roof.
Ooh.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm yes, Bob Curtis Johnson, and SummitDay Media is my company, and we've been doing this for quite a while. And literally my entire career, starting even in high school, was with media formats. So it's been that long. Let's just say. And Hayley, really quick, let's see, I had a note here. I totaled up 303 hours from the durations of all the files that we delivered to you. So you should be looking at 303 hours of content there.
Okay, that's awesome. That brings it down quite a bit. But we had the vinyl records and the other two. So
Yeah, I think they're excluded. Actually, for some reason, I didn't see those durations, but you had some micro cassettes in that project, as I recall. Yeah. So let me fire up my little PowerPoint here. I'm afraid it's dry, and so what I wonder if anybody wants to take a quick comment moment and tell me what you're specifically interested in that you'd rather I focused on rather than just whatever I thought I was going to say. Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well, I have a question. So is there something that can be done to improve outcome? So I'm wondering, like, if they're at a lower temperature, or like I said, cleaning between each use of the tape. And what can we do, or what do you recommend to help improve outcome?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else?
I'm sure people will come up with more questions.
Yep. Okay.
As we go.
This is your chance to defend yourselves from my
Your presentation is not.
monologue.
I saw one of the slides. It's pretty funny.
Well, yeah, we'll hope. Okay, let's see. Yeah. Go into mode here. Yep. So I will just I'll fly through these somewhat quickly. I'll try not to go. Some of them do go deep, and I think it's for today. It's mostly just letting you know that there is depth if you want to go there and when you do run a project with us, we'll ask you for make some specific decisions. And you may be far along. So I do have just some of the basic informational outlines here that folks can take a look at. And if you're well beyond that, then just take a moment, and anyone else who's seen it for the first time, I'm happy to be interrupted by with questions and things. Yes, planning, that turns out to be pretty important, especially when you're dealing with large numbers. Some of us have hundreds and sometimes thousands of materials. We are in the middle of a roughly 2,000 tape batch of video and audio that we're doing for KYUK right now. Probably going to be about at least 500 audio cassettes in that group, and the rest of that would be video. And that, especially when we're doing video, and they're delivering uncompressed video format. So there'll be close to 100 terabytes of delivery media. And that's where the LTO tape comes, because very few, I challenge anyone really to spin on hard drives in a safe way 100 terabytes of data. And portable hard drives, you should remember, are not long-term. They're temporary and may stop at any point when you think they're going to fire up. So the purpose of the LTO tape is to give us that durability, and we'll talk more about that later. So again, this comes back to planning. What am I going to do with all that stuff once I have it? That's stopping at the beginning and thinking all the way through the end. Why am I doing, as Nikkita said, selection? Which ones should I do first? Am I doing the, well, for instance, especially in video and other things, there's a format obsolescence urgency, because the formats are going away sometimes faster. Audio cassettes, yes, we can still play those fairly safely, but if you've got a case where you've got a format that is seriously endangered, that may be something you move on automatically, whether or not it has, you think it has important content on it. Just some of the decision making. So a lot of things to think about. I'll just skip over, like I was just saying at the top. Format obsolescence or content urgency, language, especially language and culture feels urgent. It is urgent. And especially when language education is a priority, that's a good argument for trying to get as much done as possible, as quickly as possible. You want to estimate the maximum total content on your, we call them carriers, but on your assets, your tapes. Is this a 120-minute cassette, or is this a 15-minute cassette? Obviously, there's a limit to how much could be on there. And then from that maximum possible limit, we try to estimate, as Hayley said, how much we think is on there. And 66 to, 2/3 is fairly safe, and it comes into a window there. And within the first 50 tapes, maybe on a project, transfer project, we'll start to get an idea of what the likely outcome is in terms of content, so we can give you a heads up. A preservation plan, of course, is what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What format are we selecting, and why are we selecting it? And you're putting all that into one place so you can hand that down through the ages, and everyone understands why you did what you did way back there in 2023. What were they thinking? What was their intention, and how did they go about it? And this is a formal plan that you would include with your collection. Then you decide if you're going to do it in-house or outsource it to a lab of some kind or a service provider. Are you using grants? Do you have the staffing to do it? How long do we think it's going to take? What's a realistic estimate? I'll tell you right now, they're always optimistic, even our own, right, Hayley? Like SummitDay cannot promise sometimes, and especially the last 3 years, I think we can see why, but sometimes it just takes a little longer. And, you know, as long as we don't have an urgent deadline, that seems to be okay with most of us. If there are urgent deadlines, we should know that in advance and know what exactly the issues are around that. Then you digitize, you know, you got data storage, where are you going to put all this stuff? And we talked that through. What are you going to do with the tapes when they come back? Over my career, I've had endlessly asked the question of, can I throw them away? And museums, I don't think would be in that mindset, but surprisingly, there is this idea of, you know, I've moved the content, and that in our field is called migration. So we're migrating the content from the original carrier, which is the tape, onto a new medium. And when you do that, you need to start treating that digital file as your preservation asset, because the tapes will continue to physically decay, but you need to have the reverence and the care and the concern transfer to the digital file and make that your most important, you know, historic asset there. You keep the original tape because, especially right now, we can still recapture that if we think we have a need to, or new technology comes along and we want to make a new preservation asset from the original carrier. But at the torch kind of gets passed when you do this to a preservation format. So you're storing those original source media in a safe place with proper conditions against the day you'd actually want to access them again. And then content access. What are you going to do with all this hundreds of hours of material you may have coming back from them? So that's good. This is basic archive strategy, putting things into intellectual control, creating a catalog, giving unique identifiers to each asset, keeping your records organized. Physical control. So a lot of times you run into folks that just have a bunch of boxes, or they're in different homes, or they're in board members' garages or something, and a project kind of is like the call-in where all in for free, everything sort of starts to make its way back to the organization and trying to create a storage environment. A lot of you folks in the museums world will not, you know, you'll be further along than this, but. So what are we making when we do these projects? So preservation, mezzanine, and access. So the mezzanine is actually an access level, but it's a high quality one. Preservation is the highest quality, highest bandwidth, hardest to play often, not easiest to work with, but you don't need to access it a lot. It's the best quality, and most of the time you don't need that. So you make that and you stick it away, and that one is your preservation asset. And then mezzanine is sort of like if you're editing or you're doing audio production, you might want a little bit smaller quality, but one that's more convenient to use and easier to edit with. And then straight up access, usually for this, we're using MP3 at 320 kilobits. And that's a high quality sound for MP3s. And that's for researchers and all that sort of thing. And there's a really good argument for keeping the sound quality up on even an MP3 if it's going to be done with research, and that is because listener fatigue is a real thing. The brain really works when you're listening, and you're not just listening to words, but discriminating words in a noisy environment sometimes. And if you roll off a lot of the frequencies and you compress the file a lot, it's harder for researchers and they get tired more quickly. So we generally deliver 320 kilobits, which is the highest MP3 quality. And we can do anything you want, obviously, to match the rest of your collection if you want to, but that's our argument for doing higher quality access. This just goes into a little more detail about each one, but of course you want to continue to hold your physical media after the project's over. The digital media is your carrier. Not often played. I've gone through this. A lot of folks, a network attached storage, the NAS there, it's if you can get one, they're not really that expensive, you know, can get a grant together, and it's a lot better than plugging in little portable hard drives and things and trying to remember where stuff is. It's much faster to access if you're in the middle of a project where you're creating things with your higher quality access, because they still can be kind of large, especially as a video file. We're blessed that audio files, as big as they are not as troublesome to deal with as video files. This comment there under downscaling, this is the argument for a mezzanine. So we had a client, we did around 26,000 slide scans early in our work, and the deliverable files were 125 megabytes, and they were TIFFs, and just impossible to open if you were in a production environment. So we ended up making them something bigger than the PNGs there, but something in the middle that they could use for their publishing work and their news communications work and that sort of thing, without struggling with these giant TIFFs. And the not kept current. So this is the issue of access. So making sure that if you've got a team that's using the product that you're making, they need to be able to find it, and you need to set up a structure for them to easily find it. And if you don't, they will. And this was a group that didn't like the archival data asset management system that the archivists had set up. And they just started using Flickr. Even though the boss told them not to, they were like, we can't move fast enough on that other system. So it's sort of, you got to keep in mind who's your client, even as an in-house museum staff. You may have other folks who are using the material. Depends on the size of your organization, but you know, you do, others will need to access it, and that's, you want to set up your project for success with all the stakeholders. And this just gets a little more deep about some of the things that I was talking about. Same things. Risks of inaction, we've sort of thought about this, I hope, already, but format obsolescence, the physical deterioration of media. I am happy to say that it's pretty rare here in Alaska that we see really vaporized media, and with magnetic tapes of any kind, with it's basically thin pieces of metal glued onto a piece of plastic, right? That's what a cassette tape would be, a videotape. And luckily, the bond stays pretty good. Sometimes you have a lot of oxide loss. You do want to clean your players fairly regularly and be knowledgeable about how to do that. But we find that most materials are playable, and I don't know of instances where they just sort of fade away somehow off the tape. They're almost always playable unless they've been demagnetized or something has happened. So even if you think you've got something where that might be occurring, always hold on to it, because there are forensic specialists. If it's not something we can resolve, there are folks you can find in the lower 48. That always helps to know if it's worth it, right? And that's one of the problems with these undigitized collections, or if they're not easily played, it's hard to decide that it's worth your time and effort. So one of the things that we do here is we move material through in high volumes at very good quality, but not necessarily perfection, boutique, absolute final. Because there's always somebody out there that you could hire to you know, do a better copy. You know, as much as you want to pay, somebody will do it, and it may or may not be much better than what we're doing. But the goal here is maximum material into the hands as soon as we can at a very high quality, and that's what we aim for. I think the rest of this, if you scanned it through, I think it's fairly straightforward. generational ignorance is an interesting thing on the bottom there, because I'm talking to producers of some older, well-known Alaskan video programs that run the risk of, the folks who knew them when they were in their prime are, my age or older, and younger folks don't know that those programs really ever existed, and it's going to be expensive to reintroduce those programs to younger audiences, because they'll have to start from scratch if they don't have an installed, existing base of folks. And this is absolutely true in terms of language and that sort of thing. The longer you wait, there is a cost to trying to introduce that material later on. Blah, blah, blah. Who are those guys? Us. This is a NAS. This is a network attached storage that I was talking about a moment ago. This was a delivery for those 26,000 huge TIFFs. These are some of the folks we've worked with. I'm sure you'll recognize some of them. This is some of our digitizing stuff, dramatic lighting. This is a film color grading suite that we do with DaVinci when we're doing film scans and that sort of thing. And our friend Mike Martz working in the vault there. And here we are. So I'm going to just work off of Hayley's in-depth, and you may see some repeat photos here, but I think the total was around 500. I'm not sure, but I have to look back and see. At least we inventoried that many. I'm not sure exactly how many instantly right now we actually completed. But there are quite a lot of materials that we saw. Anytime you're working with materials, you got to make some choices, and this is one of the first things. This goes back, I think, to 2018 that we updated, but the first question was, what are we making in terms of a file specification? And I won't go way deep in this now, and I even urge you not necessarily to try to write anything down, because your collection is different. Your desires and goals will be different. There's no one flavor, and you may change as formats change, and formats do change, and we have even large scale collections sometimes will change for different reasons. And so, but this is kind of thing that we have to talk about before we start making things, and we would have that discussion with you. And that's part of what I do, is a lot of discussion with the client before we get going on things. Yay. Sorry about that. So this is how we got it. As we saw before, here's the paper, here's the bags. It is basically a vapor barrier, if you think about it, especially in the winter up here. It's pretty dry. We try to have things in shipping as briefly as possible, but sometimes it could be a couple of days, and your carefully humidified environments in your collection room might be 10% humidity for a couple of days, and that wouldn't be happy. So this also helps if the boxes get wet or anything happens. And then this was lovely. Hayley, I think you guys get an award because this was very clear. We could see exactly what was going on. And then these had cards inside them as we saw. And it was very easy for us to understand what was what in the collection before we started doing our thing. So generally what we do, if it's not already on there permanently, is we'll add a unit of some kind. You'll certainly want to have some kind of an inventory record. We do that here as well when we're bringing it in. That's why we barcode, just to speed that process up. We inspect them to see if they're in good playable condition. Sometimes they need a new shell. If it's a cassette media of some kind, there might be a break or a crack. Sometimes on the cassettes, you'll notice the little felt pads. The glue comes off of the little metal support that those sit on. And then when the head goes in to push against that tape, it doesn't have anything to press against. And so you get a worse capture than if there's that felt pad is there. So part of what we do is separate all those issues out and then do the repairs before those go into the pipeline for capture. Then we're going to do the digitizing, and that's where the preservation specifications come in. And then afterwards, we vet the file and we verify that we actually didn't make a mistake and capture the wrong spec, because we do have multiple projects here, not always overlapping, but sometimes, and we're human. And I'll just say, everybody forgive ourselves immediately, yourselves and ourselves, because humans make mistakes, and especially when you've got large amounts of anything, numbers get transposed sometimes, errors happen, and that's just part of the joy of being human. So we try to double check, and we do that with some software systems that help verify that, and I'll show those quickly. And then we're going to create the preservation, the access files. From the preservation files. I like to do that directly from the preservation file, so that the access file is always a derivative of the actual preservation file and not a simultaneous capture or something that could have a different quality than the master file. And then needs to go onto its own storage media, and then those need to be connected somehow with the catalog records or create catalog records, so for your access. So how are people gonna be able to hear that, or how are you gonna present that to the public? Here's one of our inventory records here on our database. This is you can see Hayley's CAS 164 there, and we took photos when they arrived. And we do this for a number of reasons. One, we don't get lost, and we can see the item when we're doing the digitizing. We call up the inventory records, and they're right there in front of us. And so if we're holding a tape and it doesn't look like this, or it's a black cassette shell with a yellow label, then we're wait a second, hold on. Doesn't happen too much, but it's just one more benefit. And then you see the job number. We have an in-house job number. We've identified the format. We know what box it's in our storage vaults, the location. We take the maximum lengths, and that's so that we can do the estimating. And then the assessment, you see that the assessment flag has passed, so it's ready to be digitized. And then there's a special note there, say, hey, wait, what's this? Is this rust or dirt? So take a look at that when you're working with it. And that one is ready to go to digitizing. And then maybe, if there was a damage of some kind, this is, I don't see a pencil here, but there should be one. But that's the tape barf. Is that what you called it, Hayley? Yeah. Anyway. A lot of fun comics and stuff around cassettes. So this is the capturing workstation. Since this picture was taken, this was only a couple of months ago. We now have a second Audacity station to the left there, where that older monitor is. We now do 2 simultaneous captures at once. And we're using Audacity as we described, and we have Sterling Harmony as the capture devices, and we've got a Mackie big knob that we can switch back and forth for monitoring on the speakers, so we can hear the quality as it's being captured. And somebody will just sit there and watch the waveforms go by and take notes during the middle of it. And basically our notes when we take captures is a conversation to future archivists and our own quality control folks who are going to be listening to the files later in the process, to say, yes, there's some distortion in there. The mic is blown out. No, it didn't happen during the capture. I saw it, and tell you that was something that happened in the original recording. And those notes go out and are with the project, so that we can verify that if we hear that later on, if we know that was something that was baked in the original tape. And if we hear something and we don't see it in the capture note, we go back and we pull the tape and we locate that and try to decide if that was something that should have been caught in the capture and wasn't, or whether it's just something that wasn't mentioned in the capture notes. This is what we call our validator. This is a homegrown coding here, and we're using a little bit of open source tools here to inject some metadata. And at the top, you can see this is for KYUK actually, but this was where are the files at? What metadata are we injecting? What's the file suffix on the file? And how long are the identifiers? Are they 4 or 5 characters? Are we creating checksums in this pass? And those are digital files that tell you an exact bit for bit number that it represents the file. And so you can tell later whether the file has changed from when it was originally created. And those are really useful because archivists would like to vet that from year to year and maybe understand if everything's going well in the collection. Then we can do refoldering. So a bunch of this stuff, applying, especially at the bottom here where you see media conch, that's a tool that is available. You set up your own policies and then you can vet your own files against your policy and make sure that you're sticking with the project spec as you go and you can catch errors that way if somebody accidentally was supposed to do 48K and they did 96K or something like that. Depends on the spec and depends on the client. And the directory that you want to put your reports because you spit out reports. So we do this because this is faster than doing it manual and it saves labor and it saves cost to the customer and speeds up the process and it's very precise, whereas again, humans do make mistakes. This is, we call this Presto, but this is our preservation tool. This is another thing it's similar, but it's something that we, again, built. And we use FFmpeg behind the scenes for this. And I think, MediaConch is also involved. If you look over on the left side, you see all those WAV files in green. The fact that they're green means that they've already passed the MediaConch spec for this project when they were originally added into this field. Before we even ran it, that was the first thing that happens, and so you get alerted if there's a problem with the spec right from the beginning. And then the wave and all this other stuff. So we're access script 1 right in the middle. You can see MP3 320 kilobits, generate audio spectrograph waveform. These are things that we can automatically create in their deliverables to go out with the project. And so this is kind of the things that we're using to speed up here so that the humans at Summit Day can be used for what humans are best at and needed for, which is sort of listening, discernment, aesthetic judgment, and catching errors and doing things that we're not worn out from doing some of this other thing that it's more automated type of process. And this was going out the door. I'm not sure how deeply everybody is aware of the optical media, the gold optical media as an option. Those are DVDs, by the way, but that's a data DVD, not a video format, but a data DVD, just because it's sheer size, much larger than a CD. You can store a lot more WAV files on there. The beauty of that is that it's not magnetic. Optical, it's digital, but it's not magnetic. And so if there were sunspots or other anomalies that, God help us all, affected our magnetic media, which almost every hard drive, every data tape, everything out there, the optical files would survive. And so it's an alternative to magnetic storage, and practically all data that we're using most of the time is magnetic. So it's just another way to be future-proofed. But it is challenging because with video, we can't really do that. They're 4.6 gigs on a data DVD, and you just can't really get a lot of video usually, and that's a pretty small video file. So it works well for 1 or 2 gigabyte WAV files. But as you saw in Hayley's she ended up with a lot of discs. And then the data tapes are wonderful because they're enterprise quality, designed to be, corporate data backups. And so they're very robust, very forgiving format. You can practically read these things, under the worst case scenarios. And so that is the best place for most people to take their preservation media on, because keeping it spinning on a big platform, not a lot of folks have a major IT department. And at any time I've ever even talked to a large IT department and I said, we're planning to show up with 80 terabytes, they just give you a double take, because the corporate data set might be 5 terabytes or something, or 4, so they're like, excuse me. So it works better for everybody. And that seems to be the best case. And I'm happy to report that we're moving to LTO 8, but even go back to LTO 5 and even 4, some of that, it's just so durable and has been durable that there's not a lot of need to be migrating from version to version in LTO with a lot of urgency. Format obsolescence would be the thing you'd think about, but this is such a pervasive format, even if you've never heard of it before, it's really pervasive and it's able to be read going back many versions. So I would argue that you probably don't need, maybe if you have stuff on LTO 5, you might want to move to 8 or 9, but it's not something you have to worry about every time a new version comes out. Interestingly, the size, it just increases exponentially. Like these are 2.6 terabytes uncompressed, and LTO 8 now is 11 terabytes uncompressed per tape. So easier to load things on there, and worse if you lose a tape, because suddenly you're losing a lot more data. And this is just some ideas about project benefits and why you would do a project, that sort of thing. And that's who I am, and that's Lopke.
Everyone needs a dog.
Lopke's left this mortal coil, but she was wonderful. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. That was really, really helpful and informative. Helen?
Yeah, Bob, I was wondering, so for the Ketchikan project, that amount of material, what is it? What's the cost? I mean, what is it? Sending that to you, how much are you charging for what you send back?
This is why we need to do the estimating and do the content. So the max lengths are the issue. In the very earliest days of SummitDay, we would do just a tape charge, per tape charge. But there were a couple of projects that we got bitten on. And the best way to imagine it is if you said, well, I'm going to have you work with 100 cardboard boxes. Well, are those boxes full? I'm going to move 100 cardboard boxes. Are they empty? Are they full of books? Are they half full? Big difference on how many staff you might need to move those, and the weight that's going to be moved and where they're going to. And the same thing is true because the handling of the tapes isn't radically different. But once you have the data, it's a much bigger thing in terms of labor, because you want a quality control, you want to vet all the content. It affects the storage and how long it takes to write out the data. And so if you've got 10% of your maximum possible length on there, you've got very, very little time invested. But if you end up with 100% of it, it's a much bigger delivery, and it slows us down quite a bit. So that's one thing that we're looking at all the time. So we don't, unfortunately, I don't have like a fixed amount. I'll leave it up to Hayley if she wants to share her project budgets, and that's fine with me if she does. But the upshot is we need some kind of metric to give you an estimate, and we will happily do that. The first thing we usually ask people to do is to go through and at least get a maximum length on your media, especially with cassettes. It's usually easy to do because right on the outside of almost all of them, it'll say 15 minutes, 30, C60, C90 go, 120. And so you can sort of break that down. And if you can tell us that you've got 50 120s and 100 90s and that sort of thing, then we can come back and we can give you an estimate on that. Because again, we're going to target maybe 60%, and then once we start, we'll verify whether that's holding or not.
Well, but you said you had 500 hours with what she provided, so 500 data hours. So what does that equate to?
300. I totaled 300 hours.
Okay, 300. So how much is it per 100 hours? Let's say. What would you estimate?
Again, it's not that easy because it depends on the source media that it's coming from. Like a micro cassette is a single channel. A cassette, if it's recorded on 2 channels, like dual mono, that's double the size. If it's a 48K capture versus 96, going to 96 doubles the deliverable of the data. So, you go from 500 megabytes to a gigabyte just by changing from 48K to 96K capture. So this is, again, it's so flexible that I need to know something about what you want before we can easily give you an estimate. And it's just the way it is. What you want affects what the price is.
Yeah,
I know that's hard, but what I'm saying is throw some numbers at me and I will throw you back some estimate, and then you can refine it from there.
One of the nice things about working with Bob and his company, like we've sent off some media, both of the grants that we got that didn't have content on them. So those we weren't charged for. We were only charged for actual content.
Yeah, that's the thing. If half of these have blank side Bs, that's not in the content calculation. And we skip through. Generally, people do not want us to straight capture a blank side. Sometimes people do, and they want to make the decision and say, I'll be the one who says there's nothing on there. Because what if you make a mistake, SummitDay? That's valid, completely valid, and we'll capture it if you like. What we commonly do, and people ask us to do, is we just skip forward every 2 minutes and we'll check and listen for 5 seconds every 2 minutes. And if we don't hear anything across the whole tape, kick it back. We ran into one just the other day. We're about 6 or 7 minutes in. There was about a 2-minute recording, and then nothing for the rest of the 90-minute sides.
Double check it. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, you end up with 87 minutes less in your data output for that side of that tape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Did anyone else have any questions for anyone? For Bob or Hayley or Nikkita?
Do you mind a safety and health question? Oh, sorry, Helen.
No, I was going to say I can keep asking questions, but
go
else,
for it.
Go ahead, Gina.
No, as you all were speaking, this is my opportunity to learn about your industry. So I was trying to search for employee safety and handling, and I saw that molds and sometimes pests can contaminate. And then I read about vinegar syndrome too. Have any of you ever encountered all of that, and how do you approach it? What type of personal protective equipment do you use, or what do you do to manage it?
I can chime in with a lack of experience in this area. We've been really fortunate that our analog media has not had those kind of issues. I think before my time, there were some photos or films that had vinegar syndrome, and those had gone into a freezer. And I think that they were eventually deaccessioned and disposed of, so that they weren't around as potential hazards. But we generally try to keep our collection storage areas clean and do regular pest monitoring to kind of stay on top of any issues?
And I can speak to it from a conservator standpoint. We have acid detection strips we put in with the media. We start to see an issue, but mostly air dilution, airflow helps reduce that. And of course, all of these are polymers, and the reaction rate of deterioration will slow the more you lower the temperature.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was curious when you talked about just now air dilution and air movement, how that are most of your basements in our smaller facilities, do they have a lot of air movement? Is that managed in our smaller historical sites?
If you don't have air coming in, you can use things like charcoal filters to absorb fumes. So I've done that in refrigerators, like we've installed a refrigerator and then put in charcoal filters to help absorb any deterioration byproducts from the plastics. But there's always a way of dealing with it, but ideally you're not in the basement with the storage.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a wide variety of resources available for the storage environments, and a lot of times people are in there and it's just a thing. And keep in mind that deacetylation, that's vinegar syndrome, is not just in film. It can be, especially in 1/4 inch. It depends on if it's on an acetate base, and an easy way to check is just hold a 1/4 inch reel up to the light, and if you can see light through it, it's probably acetate, and it's probably a danger for vinegar syndrome. And you can tell with your nose if you've got an issue. Luckily in Alaska, we don't have that much of it. What we see here mostly is from collections that were stored outside at some period of time, because it's fairly dry in areas, and where it's fairly wet in Alaska, it's not usually that hot for very long. So heat and humidity is a combination that'll kick that off. And the AD test strips, I think, Helen, is that what you were talking about? Yeah, those are excellent. If you have acetate materials, get them through the what's the Preservation Institute?
Image Permanence Institute.
Image Permanence, thank you.
Rochester.
Yep.
Image permanence?
Image Permanence Institute.
IPI. Through the film, but at Rochester, who's the film? Is it Kodak? Can't remember which film company it is that's out of Rochester, New York.
No, it's Kodak.
It's Kodak. It was Kodak, yeah. So they started the Image Permanence Institute.
If anybody has it in Anchorage, can you call me? Because I would love to come see it, smell it, know that I've actually
Come here.
encountered it.
We got some for you. We had some films that were shipped to us from Hawaii.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence that just storing acetate or vinegar films next to other films is not an automatic indicator of somehow it's going to catch it like a disease. There's many stories from some of the best film archivists I know where they're stacks and stacks of fresh film stacked next to stacks and stacks of vinegar, and they just never didn't happen. And so it's not an automatic risk, although that seems natural. But the venting of the cans is something that's new over the last 25 years. They used to be in these sealed metal cans, and that's why upgrading to breathable inert plastics for the film cans is the right way to go. And with any acetate based material, for sure.
I think, and I don't know that we see a lot of it in Alaska, but I think more problematic is the nitrate based films, because those deteriorate and they can catch fire at room temperature if they are deteriorated badly enough. And we've had a few incidences of that occurring in museums.
They need a spark, but the biggest issue with them is they're nearly impossible to put out. Even you can chuck them in a bucket of water when they're burning. But the good news is that most nitrate by now that ever existed has the stuff that has melted. And if it's still around, it's been fairly stable, and it does show up every once in a while. I imagine there's more nitrate negatives, still photographic negatives in Alaska than there is motion picture film, would be my guess.
And I think we're seeing it mostly in plastic toys and things like that.
Oh, interesting.
We've had some museums have problems with those.
Interesting.
What decade was that from? The nitrate.
Anything up to what? I'm impressed on the date, 1940s maybe?
Up
the end of
to,
it?
yeah, I'd say about 90, because
Early
it
40s?
was called safety film. The acetate film was
Well,
called
no-
safety film.
That started, that's the replacement for nitrate, was
Yeah.
the safety film. That's acetate. Yeah. And the nitrate was one of the earlier compounds, and there were lots of tries and attempts in the early days to come up with.
Like in the 20s and 30s, you heard about all these horrible movie theater fires. It was because of they
Yeah.
were
Very
the
hot,
nitrate.
the lamps,
Yeah.
it's the lamps, and the lamps would trigger the fire, and then they couldn't put it out, and yeah, so that's how it got the association for that.
Okay. But the asbestos curtains would survive.
Mold, do people see a lot of mold? I don't know. That's a,
That's a good question.
Oh. Okay, so we're at the end of our 1 hour 30, but Megan, you just said something. What did you say? Lots of questions, but have to leave. So look forward to following with the panelists. Okay, thank you, Megan. I appreciate it. This recording, I'll be sending it out to everyone who signed up for the webinar, and everyone gave their information. So if you would like to follow up with questions, I'm sure all the speakers would be delighted to talk to you.